Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. In the remote village of Evershade, nestled deep in a misty valley, the townsfolk whispered about a peculiar phenomenon. It began subtly, shadows that didn't quite align with their owner's movements. At first it was dismissed as a trick of the light, a strange quirk caused by the ever-present fog that blanketed the area. But as the days turned to weeks, the anomalies grew more unsettling. Shadows lingered longer than they should have, moving even after their owners were still. Some shadows appeared larger or smaller than they should be, stretching across walls like dark, fluid tendrils. The villagers grew wary, avoiding the streets after dusk and keeping candles burning in their homes. But light did little to stop the shadows. They seemed to gain strength from the fear that gripped Evershade. The true terror began when Martha Kilburn, a seamstress known for her kind heart, went missing. Her disappearance coincided with an account from her neighbor Edgar, who claimed he had seen her shadow moving erratically in the moonlight the night before. It was as if it had a mind of its own, Edgar said, his voice trembling. Martha was standing still, but her shadow, it writhed like a living thing. Search parties scoured the village and the surrounding forests, but no trace of Martha was ever found. The only clue left behind was her sewing room, where the candle had burned out, leaving her shadow etched unnaturally dark across the floorboards. Word of the strange occurrences reached the nearby city, drawing the attention of a reclusive scholar named Elias Grayson, who specialized in occult phenomena. Elias was a tall, wiry man with piercing gray eyes and an air of relentless curiosity. He arrived in Evershade armed with tomes of forgotten knowledge, intricate devices, and a determination to uncover the truth. The villagers were hesitant to speak with Elias, fearing that meddling with the shadows would only make matters worse. However, a young woman named Clara volunteered to assist him. Clara's father had vanished years ago under similar circumstances, and she was desperate for answers. Elias and Clara began their investigation by speaking with the oldest resident of Evershade, Agnes Hawthorne, who had lived through more than 8 decades of the village's history. Agnes revealed a chilling tale. Long ago, she began, Evershade was cursed by a traveler who sought shelter here. He was a strange man, cloaked in black, and his shadow seemed to dance even when he stood still. The villagers feared him and drove him away, refusing him food or warmth. Before he left, he turned back and spoke a curse upon us. You shall never escape your shadows, for they will one day betray you. Elias found the story intriguing, but needed proof. He began analyzing the shadows themselves, setting up experiments with lanterns and mirrors. To his astonishment, the shadows seemed to resist the light, bending and twisting unnaturally to avoid being banished. One evening, Elias and Clara were in the village square conducting tests when they noticed something alarming. Clara's shadow had stopped following her movements. Instead, it hovered behind her, standing perfectly still as she moved. Elias lit several candles around her, but the shadow only grew darker, as if absorbing the light. It began to move on its own, stretching toward Elias. He stepped back in alarm, and Clara collapsed, clutching her chest. It feels cold, she whispered. Elias realized the shadows were not mere reflections of light, but entities, beings that lived in the darkness and fed on their host's fear and life force. Elias pored over his books, searching for a way to break the curse. He discovered an ancient ritual that could sever the bond between the shadows and their owners, but it required great sacrifice. The ritual needed to be performed at the Obsidian Hollow, a jagged gorge just outside the village, where the cursed traveler was said to have been driven. Clara, despite her weakening condition, insisted on accompanying Elias. Together, they convinced the villagers to help, though many were too terrified to venture out after sunset. The group set out at dusk, carrying torches, lanterns, and Elias's prepared tools. As they neared the Obsidian Hollow, the shadows around them became more aggressive, writhing and lashing out like living creatures. At the edge of the hollow, Elias began the ritual, chanting from an ancient text while Clara and the others held a circle of light around him. The shadows howled, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath them. One by one, the villagers' shadows broke free, their inky forms swirling into the air before dissipating. But Clara's shadow resisted. It lunged at Elias, knocking him to the ground and extinguishing several lanterns. Clara, now barely able to stand, stepped into the center of the circle. "If you want me, take me," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. The shadow paused, its movements uncertain. Elias seized the opportunity, throwing a vial of silver powder into the air. The powder glimmered like starlight, and the shadow shrieked before dissipating into nothingness. The ritual was successful, and the curse was lifted. The shadows returned to normal, no longer defying their owners or moving of their own accord. The villagers rejoiced, though they remained wary of the darkness. Clara recovered, though she was left with a faint scar in the shape of her shadow's final grasp on her arm. Elias, satisfied with his work, prepared to leave Evershade, though he warned the villagers to always show kindness to strangers, lest the curse return. The pocket of the obsidian hollow remained a place of fear, and no one dared venture there again. Years later, a child playing in the woods near Evershade claimed to see a shadow that didn't match her movements. The villagers dismissed it as childish imagination, but some couldn't help but glance nervously at their own shadows, wondering if the curse had truly been broken, or merely slept, waiting for the right moment to return. And in the stillness of the obsidian hollow, the darkness seemed to ripple, as if something ancient and vengeful stirred once more. In the quiet town of Blackwood, nestled deep in the forest, people whispered about an urban legend that sent chills down the spines of even the bravest souls. They spoke of a figure in the shadows, a vague humanoid silhouette that appeared in the corners of rooms, alleys, or even in the periphery of vision. At first it would seem barely there, a wisp of darkness blending with its surroundings. But as time passed, if ignored, the figure would grow more solid, more tangible, and far more menacing. It started with Sarah Whitmore, a college student who had recently moved back to Blackwood to care for her ailing mother. Sarah was practical and skeptical, dismissing the local legends as superstition. That changed one night when she was studying late in her childhood bedroom. As the clock ticked past midnight, she noticed a faint shadow in the corner of the room. It looked like a smudge of darkness, but something about it felt wrong. She brushed it off as her imagination and went back to her textbooks. The next night, the shadow returned, darker and more defined. This time it looked vaguely human, with a head and shoulders that seemed to loom in the corner. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, but she told herself it was just a trick of the light. She ignored it. By the third night, the figure was unmistakable. It had the shape of a person, tall and thin, standing motionless in the same corner. Sarah tried turning on all the lights, but the figure didn't disappear. It was as if it were anchored to the shadows themselves. Her mother, Margaret, noticed Sarah's pale face at breakfast the next morning. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Margaret said, her voice hoarse from her illness. "It's nothing," Sarah lied, unwilling to worry her mother. But that night, as Sarah tried to sleep, the figure moved for the first time. It stepped forward, just one deliberate step, but it was enough to send Sarah bolting from her room. She spent the rest of the night on the couch, the living room bathed in the glow of the television. Desperate for answers, Sarah confided in her childhood friend, Mark, who still lived in town. Mark was fascinated by the paranormal and had always been intrigued by Blackwood's eerie reputation. "I've heard of this before," Mark said, flipping through an old book in his cluttered apartment. "It's called the lingering shadow. Supposedly, it's a manifestation of neglect, something that grows stronger when ignored. People say it feeds on apathy." "That's ridiculous," Sarah replied, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. "It's just a shadow." Mark gave her a grave look. "If you keep ignoring it, it won't be just a shadow. It'll become real." That night, armed with Mark's advice, Sarah returned to her room. The shadow was waiting for her, more solid than ever. It stood in the center of the room now, its head tilted as if watching her. She forced herself to speak, her voice shaky but firm. "What do you want?" The shadow didn't respond, but its form flickered, as if her words had disrupted it. Encouraged, Sarah continued, demanding to know why it was haunting her. The figure didn't vanish, but it didn't step closer either. Sarah spent the entire night staring at it, refusing to look away. Over the next few days, Sarah noticed something unsettling The shadow would vanish during the day, but reappear at night, always a little closer than before. Even when she acknowledged it, its presence didn't weaken. It only paused its advance. She began to hear faint whispers when the shadow was near, incoherent murmurs that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Mark suggested they dig deeper into the town's history, hoping to find a connection to the entity. Their research led them to the story of Thomas Grayson, a reclusive man who had lived in Blackwood a century ago. Grayson had been ostracized by the townsfolk, ignored and shunned until he died alone in his decrepit home. Legend claimed that his bitterness and despair had created a curse, a shadow that embodied his longing for attention and revenge. Sarah and Mark realized the shadow was not just an entity, it was a reflection of Grayson's anguish, and it sought recognition to regain its form. The more it was ignored, the more desperate it became, solidifying until it could act upon its rage. They devised a plan to confront the shadow directly, believing that acknowledging its pain might lay it to rest. Armed with candles, mirrors, and courage, they returned to Sarah's room that night. The shadow was waiting, fully solid now, its featureless form radiating malice. The air grew heavy as they lit the candles, their flickering light casting the shadow's form against the walls. Sarah spoke to it, her voice steady. "Thomas Grayson, we know who you are. We acknowledge your pain. But this isn't your place anymore. You need to move on." The shadow trembled, its form flickering like a dying flame. For a moment it seemed to hesitate, as if Sarah's words had reached something human within it. But the shadow wasn't ready to let go. It lunged at Sarah, its form no longer bound to the walls. Mark shouted, throwing a mirror in its path. The mirror shattered, and for a brief moment, the shadow's form splintered, its pieces scattering across the room. Energized by their success, they continued to confront the shadow, using light and words to weaken it. Each time they spoke its name, its form grew less distinct, as though the recognition it craved was also its undoing. Finally, with one last whispered apology, Sarah held up a candle directly in front of the shadow. Its form flickered and then dissolved, fading into the darkness from which it had come. The shadow never returned, but Sarah and Mark knew better than to dismiss the legend entirely. They warned the townsfolk of Blackwood to remember the story of Thomas Grayson, ensuring his name was never forgotten again. Sarah, however, couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow's essence lingered somewhere, waiting for another person to ignore the creeping darkness. To this day, in the quiet corners of Blackwood, some claim to see a faint shadow in their periphery, a figure that only grows more solid when overlooked. And those who dismiss it as a trick of the light often find themselves regretting their indifference too late. On the jagged cliffs of the small coastal town of Glenweld, there stood an ancient lighthouse known as Elder's Light. It had once been the pride of the town, its beam guiding countless ships safely through the treacherous waters below. But as years passed and modern technology rendered it obsolete, Elder's Light was abandoned, left to decay under the relentless assault of salt and wind. The townsfolk avoided the lighthouse, whispering stories of strange occurrences. They claimed shadows moved freely within its walls, unbound by the light or the people who ventured there. The few who dared to explore it often came back changed, quiet, withdrawn, and unwilling to speak of what they had seen. Some never came back at all. When Claire Pendleton, a historian and writer, arrived in Glenweld, she was immediately drawn to the lighthouse. Claire had built her career on uncovering the secrets of haunted places, turning them into best-selling books. To her, Elder's Light was the perfect subject for her next project. The townsfolk warned her against going, their faces pale as they recounted the legends. "Shadows don't behave like they should in there," said Martha Griggs, the owner of the local inn. "They move when there's no one around, and they watch you, waiting for—" She trailed off, her hands trembling. Claire dismissed their fears as superstitions, but thanked them for the warning. Armed with her camera, notebook, and a flashlight, she set off for the lighthouse the next morning. The path to Elder's Light was steep and treacherous, winding through rocky terrain. As Claire approached, she felt an unshakable sense of unease. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its once bright white paint now peeling, its windows dark and empty. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of mildew. Dust coated every surface, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant crash of waves. Claire began her exploration, taking photographs and jotting down notes. It wasn't long before she noticed something odd. Her shadow, cast by the beam of her flashlight, seemed to ripple unnaturally, as if it were moving to a different rhythm than her own. She stopped and turned quickly, but nothing was there. Shrugging it off as a trick of the light, she continued. But as she ascended the spiral staircase to the lantern room, the shadows around her grew more active. They stretched and shifted across the walls, moving independently of her and her light source. At the top of the lighthouse, the lantern room offered a breathtaking view of the ocean. The large glass panes, though cracked and grimy, let in enough light to illuminate the room. As Claire inspected the old lantern mechanism, she saw movement in her peripheral vision. Turning, she froze. Shadows were gathering in the corners of the room, pooling like liquid darkness. They began to coalesce, forming vaguely humanoid shapes. Claire backed away, her heart pounding. She raised her camera to document the phenomenon, but the shadows seemed to shy away from the lens, scattering momentarily before reforming. One shadow stepped forward, more defined than the others. Its head tilted as if observing her, and Claire felt an icy chill creep up her spine. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The shadows didn't answer, but the room grew colder. Determined to uncover the truth, Claire returned to town that evening and dove into the archives at the local library. She learned that Elder's Light had a dark past. In the late 1800s, the lighthouse keeper, Edward Harrow, had gone mad after his wife and daughter drowned in a shipwreck during a storm. Consumed by grief, Edward refused to leave the lighthouse, even as his behavior grew erratic. Townsfolk claimed to see him talking to shadows, insisting that his family was still with him. One night, the light in the tower went out during another storm, and a ship crashed into the rocks. When the townspeople investigated, they found Edward dead, his body surrounded by strange, twisting shadows that seemed to vanish as soon as they were seen. Convinced that Edward's tormented spirit was connected to the shadows, Claire returned to the lighthouse the next day. She brought with her a lantern, sage, and a recorder to document any paranormal activity. As she entered, the atmosphere was heavier than before. The shadows seemed more aggressive, darting across the walls and floors like living things. In the lantern room, Claire set up her recorder and began speaking aloud. "Edward Harrow, if you're here, I want to help you find peace. Show me a sign." The shadows swirled violently, and Claire felt a presence behind her. Turning slowly, she saw a figure standing in the center of the room. It was more solid than the others, its features almost human. "Why do you stay here, Claire asked. The figure didn't speak, but the recorder crackled to life. Through the static, a deep, mournful voice whispered, "I keep the light for them." Claire realized that Edward believed his wife and daughter were trapped in the shadows, and he stayed to protect them. But the shadows were not his family. They were something darker, feeding on his grief and despair. As she attempted to explain this, the shadows became enraged, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes. They lunged at Claire, extinguishing her lantern and plunging the room into darkness. Claire fought to relight the lantern, her hands trembling. Just as the shadows closed in, the beam of her lantern burst forth, scattering them momentarily. Seizing the opportunity, she fled the lighthouse, the shadows chasing her until she crossed the threshold. That night, Claire devised a plan to free Edward's spirit. She believed that if the lighthouse's lantern could shine again, it might break the shadow's hold. With the help of Mark, a local electrician, she repaired the mechanism and prepared to light the lamp. The shadows were relentless, attacking them as they worked. But when the lantern finally flared to life, the beam cut through the darkness, forcing the shadows to retreat. In the lantern's glow, Edward's figure appeared, his features now calm and human. He nodded at Claire, his form dissolving into light. Elder's Light was restored, and the shadows no longer plagued the lighthouse. Claire documented her experience in her book, bringing attention to the lighthouse's history and its spectral guardian. Though the shadows were gone, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't been destroyed, merely driven back into the depths of darkness, waiting for another opportunity to return. And on stormy nights when the wind howled and the sea roared, some claimed they could still see faint, twisting shadows dancing in the beam of Elder's light. The small town of Ashwood was like any other. Quiet streets, cozy homes, and a sense of community that bound its residents together. But there was one unspoken rule that everyone followed: never walk alone at night. It wasn't a curfew, nor was it strictly enforced by any law. It was a superstition, or so the younger residents thought. Tales of the night follower, a shadowy entity that stalks solitary travelers, were passed down through generations. Those who walked alone at night would hear soft footsteps behind them, feel the brush of cold air on their necks, and if they dared to look back, see nothing. Lena Harper, a college student visiting Ashwood for the summer, scoffed at the warnings. She had come to stay with her grandmother, Margaret, who was recovering from surgery. The stories about the night follower seemed like nothing more than folklore, a way to keep kids indoors after dark. "Don't test it," Margaret warned one evening as Lena prepared to meet some friends at the local diner. Lena laughed. "Come on, Grandma, it's just a story." Margaret's expression darkened. "It's not just a story. People have disappeared, Lena. Be home before dark." That night, Lena lost track of time. The laughter and chatter at the diner carried on into the late hours, and it wasn't until she checked her phone that she realized it was nearly midnight. Her friends offered to walk her home, but Lena declined. "It's only a 10-minute walk," she said. "I'll be fine." The streets were eerily quiet as she set off. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of a car engine. The dim glow of the streetlights cast long, wavering shadows across the pavement. Halfway home, she noticed it. The sound of footsteps behind her, faint but unmistakable. She stopped, her breath hitching. The footsteps stopped too. Lena turned, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the street was empty. She laughed nervously, telling herself it was her imagination. She resumed walking, but the footsteps began again, perfectly synchronized with her own. This time she quickened her pace. The footsteps matched her, growing louder, closer. Lena's heart pounded as she reached the edge of a small park. The streetlights here were dimmer, their glow barely piercing the darkness. Then she saw it. A shadow darker than the night itself moved in the periphery of her vision. It wasn't cast by the streetlights, nor did it belong to her. It was shapeless, a patch of inky blackness that seemed to ripple and shift like liquid. Lena froze, her legs refusing to move. The shadow lingered, then slithered closer, its formless mass growing as it approached. Panicking, Lena broke into a sprint, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't look back, but she could feel the entity's presence, its coldness nipping at her heels. Lena burst through her grandmother's front door, slamming it shut behind her. She locked the deadbolt and pressed her back against the door, trembling. Margaret appeared in the hallway, her face pale. "You saw it, didn't you?" Lena nodded, too shaken to speak. Her grandmother sighed, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I warned you. The night follower doesn't stop. Once it's seen you, it doesn't forget." Over the next few days, Lena's curiosity overpowered her fear. She began to research the night follower, digging through old town records and speaking to locals. The stories were chillingly consistent. The night follower wasn't a ghost or a person, but something far older. Some believed it was a fragment of darkness left over from a time before light existed. Others thought it was a curse, born from a crime committed in Ashwood's distant past. Margaret told Lena about a boy named Elliot Marston, who had disappeared when she was a child. He had walked home alone one night and was never seen again. "They searched for weeks," Margaret said, her voice trembling, "but all they found were his shoes, sitting neatly on the road." Lena tried to resume her normal routine, but the entity wouldn't let her forget. Even during the day, she felt its presence, a faint chill in warm rooms, the sensation of being watched from dark corners. At night, it was worse. She began hearing footsteps outside her window and seeing fleeting shadows that disappeared the moment she turned her head. One evening, she gathered her courage and set up a camera in her room, determined to capture evidence of the entity. She left the lights on and tried to sleep, but the oppressive feeling of being watched kept her awake. In the morning, she reviewed the footage. At first, there was nothing unusual, but around 2:30 a.m., the shadows in the room began to shift. A patch of darkness moved against the wall, growing larger until it loomed over her sleeping form. The screen went black. Desperate, Lena confided in Pastor Callahan, the local priest. The pastor had heard of the night follower, but admitted he didn't know how to stop it. It thrives on isolation, he said. It targets those who are alone. Perhaps that's its weakness. With his guidance, Lena organized a town meeting, urging the residents to band together. They agreed to implement a buddy system, ensuring no one walked alone at night. For a while, it seemed to work. Sightings of the night follower decreased, and the town's sense of safety began to return. But the night follower wasn't gone. One stormy evening, when Lena was walking home with a friend, the shadows began to stir. The entity was bolder now, appearing directly in their path. It had grown larger, more defined. Its shapeless form had twisted into something vaguely humanoid, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes that burned like embers. Lena and her friend ran, the creature pursuing them relentlessly. It moved unnaturally, gliding and twisting through the air as though the laws of physics didn't apply. Reaching the church, they burst through the doors and collapsed inside. The entity stopped at the threshold, its glowing eyes staring at them with malevolence. The church bells tolled, and the shadow hissed before retreating into the night. Though the night follower was repelled that night, it wasn't destroyed. It remained a lurking threat, a reminder of the darkness that thrived in isolation. The townsfolk of Ashwood continued their buddy system, and no one dared to walk alone after dark. But those who had seen the shadow knew it was always watching, waiting for someone to make the mistake of solitude. And Lena, though she eventually left Ashwood, could never shake the feeling that something dark still followed her, just out of sight, waiting for the night to fall. The sprawling estate atop Thornridge Hill had been abandoned for decades. Once a grand mansion belonging to the wealthy Lockwood family, it had fallen into disrepair after a series of mysterious deaths left the property uninhabited. Rumors circulated about the house being cursed, but none were more chilling than the tales of a particular room, the Shadow Room. Locals whispered about how the shadows within that room weren't just darkness, they were alive. They moved, reached out, and attacked anyone foolish enough to enter. Though many were skeptical, enough strange disappearances over the years kept the mansion shrouded in fear and intrigue. When Evelyn, a bold urban explorer with a love for the supernatural, heard the stories, she knew she had to see the Shadow Room for herself. Accompanied by her friends, Jake, Tina, and Marcus, she made plans to investigate the mansion. "This is the stuff of legends," Evelyn said, her voice filled with excitement as they drove up the winding path to the house. "Imagine the footage we'll get." Tina, the skeptic of the group, rolled her eyes. "It's just shadows, probably some weird lighting trick." Marcus, nervous but curious, added, "Or maybe it's just a story to keep people away. Old houses like this always have creepy legends." Jake grinned. "Either way, we'll be the first to uncover the truth." The group arrived at sunset, the mansion looming like a skeletal giant against the blood-orange sky. Its broken windows and crumbling facade gave the impression that it was alive, watching them approach. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, carrying the scent of decay. The grand foyer was littered with debris, and their footsteps echoed ominously as they explored. "The Shadow Room is supposed to be on the 3rd floor," Evelyn said, consulting a hand-drawn map she'd found online. Marcus shivered. "Do we really have to go straight to the scariest part?" "Of course we do," Evelyn replied, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The 3rd floor was eerily silent, the creaking of the stairs the only sound as they ascended. The hallway leading to the Shadow Room was lined with portraits of grim-faced Lockwood ancestors. Their eyes seemed to follow the group as they walked past. Finally, they reached the door. It was unremarkable, made of dark wood with a brass handle. Evelyn pushed it open, revealing a large empty room with high ceilings and faded wallpaper. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about the space, but as the group stepped inside, an unsettling chill washed over them. "This is it?" Tina asked, her voice echoing. "Doesn't look like much." But then, the shadows shifted. At first it was subtle. The shadows along the walls flickered, though there was no source of light to cause the movement. Marcus noticed it first. "Did you see that?" he whispered, pointing to a corner where the darkness seemed to thicken. Evelyn aimed her flashlight, but the beam didn't penetrate the shadow. Instead, it seemed to absorb the light, growing denser and darker. The shadows began to stretch, spilling onto the floor like ink. They slithered toward the group, slow and deliberate. "Okay, this is officially creepy," Jake said, backing toward the door. Before anyone could react, the shadows surged forward. They rose from the floor, forming tendrils that lashed out with unnatural speed. One wrapped around Tina's ankle, pulling her to the ground. "Help!" she screamed, kicking at the inky darkness. Jake and Marcus grabbed her arms, trying to pull her free, but the shadow's grip was cold and unyielding. Evelyn shone her flashlight directly at it, and the shadow recoiled with a hissing sound, releasing Tina. "It doesn't like the light," Evelyn shouted. The group huddled together, their flashlights forming a protective circle. The shadows writhed angrily, retreating to the corners, but not disappearing. They circled the group like predators, waiting for a moment of weakness. As the shadows closed in again, Evelyn remembered a detail she'd read about the mansion. The Lockwoods had dabbled in occult practices, and one ancestor, Josephine Lockwood, was rumored to have cursed the room during a seance gone wrong. "There's a mirror," Evelyn shouted, scanning the room. "The legend said something about a mirror being the key." Jake pointed to the far wall, where a large ornate mirror hung. Its surface was cracked and tarnished, but it seemed to pulsate faintly, as though alive. "We need to get to it," Evelyn said. The group made a dash for the mirror, their flashlights barely keeping the shadows at bay. As they reached it, Evelyn noticed an inscription along the frame. "To banish the dark, return it to the light." "What does that mean?" Marcus asked, panicking as the shadows grew more aggressive. "It means we have to use the mirror," Evelyn said, her voice resolute. She shone her flashlight directly into the mirror, and the light refracted, spreading across the room. The shadows screamed, a sound that was neither human nor animal, and began to dissolve. The room shook violently, the walls cracking as the shadows writhed in agony. The light from the mirror grew brighter, filling every corner of the room and forcing the darkness back. "Run!" Evelyn yelled, grabbing Tina's hand and pulling her toward the door. The group fled down the stairs, the mansion groaning as if it were alive. By the time they reached the front door, the light from the mirror had faded, and the house fell silent once more. Outside, the group stood in stunned silence, watching as the mansion seemed to settle into its eerie stillness. "What just happened?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. Evelyn looked back at the house. "I think we disturbed something we weren't meant to." Though they escaped, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows weren't truly gone. The mirror's inscription haunted her thoughts, and she wondered if the light had merely pushed the darkness back, waiting for its next victim. Word of their encounter spread quickly through Ashwood, adding new layers to the legend of the Shadow Room. The mansion remained abandoned, a grim monument to the dangers within. And on moonless nights, passers-by swore they could see shadows moving in the broken windows, waiting for the next intruders to enter their domain. For years, travelers passing through the sleepy town of Hollow Creek had whispered about a spectral train station that appeared only at the stroke of midnight. Known locally as the Midnight Station, it was said to emerge from the mist on abandoned train tracks just outside town. According to the legend, those who entered the station never returned. Some said it was a portal to another world. Others believed it was a trap laid by restless spirits. Skeptics dismissed it as nothing more than folklore, but the stories persisted, growing darker with each retelling. No one knew why the station appeared or where the train that arrived at its platform went. But one thing was certain: the Midnight Station was not a place for the living. When Clara Bennett, an aspiring journalist, heard about the Midnight Station, she was immediately intrigued. A lover of mysteries and urban legends, she saw the story as her chance to make a name for herself. Clara had been visiting her grandmother in Hollow Creek for a few weeks, spending her days wandering the quiet streets and gathering tales from the locals. But the Midnight Station was unlike anything she'd encountered before. "You're wasting your time, dear," her grandmother said one evening as Clara pored over her notes. "It's just a story parents tell to keep their kids away from the old tracks." "Then why does everyone have a different version of the same story?" Clara countered. Her grandmother sighed. "Because people like to believe in things they can't explain. But take my advice. Don't go looking for it. Some mysteries are better left unsolved." Clara ignored the warning, armed with a camera, flashlight, and notebook. She made her way to the abandoned tracks on the night of the next full moon. The tracks lay hidden beneath overgrown grass and twisted vines, stretching into the darkness like a forgotten relic. Clara set up her equipment near an old railway sign that read, Hollow Creek Junction. Its letters faded and rusted. The air was unnervingly still, the usual chorus of crickets and rustling leaves eerily absent. Clara checked her watch. It was 11:45 p.m. As the minutes ticked by, a thick fog began to roll in, shrouding the area in a ghostly haze. Clara felt a chill creep up her spine, but she shook it off. It's just the weather, she told herself, gripping her flashlight tightly. At exactly midnight, a low, mournful whistle pierced the silence. Clara's breath caught as the fog parted, revealing the outline of a train station where there had been nothing moments before. The structure was impossibly intact, its iron beams gleaming under the pale moonlight. A flickering sign above the entrance read, Hollow Creek Station. She approached cautiously, her flashlight illuminating the cobblestone platform. The station seemed frozen in time, its benches polished, and a clock on the wall stopped at midnight. Gas lamps along the platform flickered with an otherworldly glow. Clara raised her camera, snapping pictures as she moved closer. Her heart raced with a mix of fear and exhilaration. Then she heard it, a train approaching. The sound of wheels grinding against the tracks grew louder, accompanied by another mournful whistle. Through the fog, Clara saw the train emerge. Its exterior shimmered, as if made of liquid silver, and its windows glowed faintly with a ghostly light. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open with an eerie hiss. Clara hesitated, staring into the empty carriages. The air seemed to hum with an unspoken invitation. "Step aboard," a voice whispered. Clara whirled around, but no one was there. Against her better judgment, she took a tentative step toward the train. Inside, the train was both beautiful and unsettling. The seats were upholstered in rich velvet, and chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting soft light. But it was the passengers that made Clara's blood run cold. The carriages were filled with people dressed in outdated clothing, Victorian gowns, 1920s flapper dresses, and World War II uniforms. They sat in eerie silence, their faces pale and their eyes blank. Clara moved cautiously down the aisle, her camera clicking. The passengers didn't react to her presence, as if they were frozen in time. At the end of the car, an old conductor stood, his uniform pristine. He turned to Clara, his face shadowed beneath his cap. "Ticket?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I don't have one," Clara stammered. The conductor tilted his head. "Everyone has a ticket. Yours is simply unwritten." Before Clara could respond, the train lurched forward. She grabbed a nearby pole for balance, panic rising in her chest. "I don't want to go anywhere," she said, her voice shaking. The conductor smiled faintly. "This train goes where it is needed. You are here for a reason." The words sent a chill through Clara. "What do you mean? What reason?" Instead of answering, the conductor gestured toward the window. Outside, the fog swirled, revealing scenes from Clara's past. A childhood argument with her mother, a painful breakup, the funeral of her father. "You carry the weight of these moments," the conductor said. "The midnight station offers a choice: confront them or remain forever." The train slowed, stopping at a platform that wasn't there before. Outside, Clara saw her childhood home bathed in twilight. The scene was achingly familiar, but something was off. There were shadows moving within, distorted and wrong. "If you wish to leave, you must face what you fear most," the conductor said, his expression unreadable. Clara hesitated, her instincts screaming to stay on the train. But she knew she couldn't run forever. With a deep breath, she stepped onto the platform. Inside the house, the shadows came alive. They took the forms of her regrets and fears. Her mother's disappointed gaze, her ex-boyfriend's angry words, the sound of her father's final breath. Clara fought against the memories, reliving each painful moment. But as she confronted them, the shadows began to dissipate, their forms unraveling like smoke. "You are stronger than you believe," the conductor's voice echoed in her mind. When Clara stepped back onto the platform, the train was waiting. The passengers, still silent, watched her with newfound clarity in their eyes. The conductor nodded approvingly. "You've earned your departure," he said. The train carried her back to Hollow Creek, vanishing just as the first light of dawn broke through the fog. Clara's experience changed her. She returned to the town with a newfound sense of purpose, documenting the Midnight Station in a best-selling book. While many dismissed her story as fiction, those who had seen the station knew the truth. To this day, the Midnight Station appears at the stroke of midnight, offering its passengers a chance to confront their past or remain lost forever in its ghostly embrace. Blackwood Asylum had been abandoned for over half a century, a crumbling monument to a dark and tragic past. Built in 1902, it was originally intended as a sanctuary for the mentally ill. However, underfunding, overcrowding, and cruel treatment methods turned it into a house of horrors. Stories of abuse, mysterious deaths, and unexplained disappearances plagued the asylum until it was finally shuttered in 1965. Since then, Blackwood had become a haven for urban legends. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the screams that echoed through its decaying halls at night, or the ghostly figures that appeared in the broken windows. Many claimed the spirits of former patients, tormented and angry, still roamed the asylum, seeking justice or vengeance. Despite the warnings, the asylum had become a magnet for thrill seekers, ghost hunters, and curious explorers. Few who entered dared to stay long, driven away by the oppressive atmosphere and unshakable feeling of being watched. For Lila, Ethan, Maggie, and Jason, Blackwood Asylum represented the ultimate test of courage. The four friends had spent years chasing urban legends, filming their adventures for their small but loyal online audience. When they stumbled upon stories about Blackwood, they knew they had found their next challenge. "We stay the whole night," Lila said, her voice steady despite the unease in her eyes. "No running out, no excuses. We're going to prove this place is just an empty building with a bad reputation." Ethan smirked. "You mean we're going to get the best footage of our lives and finally hit 1 million views?" Maggie, the group's skeptic, shrugged. "I'm in. Ghosts aren't real anyway." Jason, the most superstitious of the group, hesitated. "Are we sure about this? Some things are better left alone." "Come on, Jason," Lila said, clapping him on the back. "It's just an old building. What's the worst that could happen?" The group arrived at Blackwood just after sunset. The asylum loomed before them, its Gothic architecture silhouetted against a blood-red sky. Ivy clung to the walls and broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets. "Creepy doesn't even begin to describe this place," Maggie muttered, gripping her flashlight tightly. Jason held up his camera, panning across the building. "This place gives me the chills." They entered through a side door, the rusted hinges screaming in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The flashlight beams revealed peeling paint, crumbling plaster, and graffiti scrawled across the walls. "Welcome to Blackwood Asylum," Ethan said into his camera, his voice dripping with mock bravado, "where the past meets the paranormal." The group began their exploration on the ground floor, filming as they moved through the asylum's eerie, empty corridors. They passed what had once been a reception area, a crumbling nurse's station, and several patient rooms. Each space seemed to echo with the weight of forgotten pain. "Did anyone else hear that?" Jason suddenly asked, his voice trembling. The others paused, listening. From somewhere deep within the building came the faint sound of laughter, childlike, yet wrong. "It's probably just the wind," Maggie said, though her expression betrayed her uncertainty. "Or some other thrill seekers messing with us," Lila added. But as they continued, the sounds grew louder. Whispers, footsteps, and the occasional wail. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on them, making it harder to breathe. In the records room, the group discovered a treasure trove of old patient files. Lila flipped through a yellowed folder, reading aloud. "Patient 142, Evelyn Harper, committed in 1932 for hysteria. Died under mysterious circumstances in 1935. Ethan frowned. "What does mysterious circumstances mean?" "Probably a cover-up for abuse," Maggie said. "Places like this were notorious for it." Jason was studying the walls where faded writing could still be seen beneath layers of grime. "Guys, look at this." The words, scrawled in a trembling hand, read, "They hurt us. They never let us leave." A sudden crash echoed from the hallway, making everyone jump. They rushed out, but the corridor was empty. The deeper they ventured into the asylum, the more active the spirits became. Shadows flitted across their peripheral vision, and cold spots appeared without warning. In one room, a wheelchair moved on its own, its wheels creaking in the silence. Ethan, trying to capture as much as possible, kept the camera rolling. "This is gold," he whispered, though his hands were shaking. In the children's ward, the group found small, dusty beds lined up in rows. Lila picked up a broken doll, its porcelain face cracked. "Do you think the kids here?" she began, but her words were cut off as the temperature plummeted. From the shadows, a small figure emerged. It was a child, or what had once been one. Its translucent skin glowed faintly, and its hollow eyes stared unblinkingly at them. The group froze, too terrified to move. The child raised an arm, pointing toward the hallway. "Leave," it whispered. Ignoring the warning, the group pressed on, drawn to the asylum's infamous isolation ward. The air grew heavier with each step, the walls seeming to close in around them. In the ward, they found rows of padded cells, their doors hanging ajar. Inside one cell, Jason found a diary belonging to a former patient. Its final entry read, "They're always watching. Even now, there is no escape." As he read, the door slammed shut behind him. The others rushed to pry it open, but their efforts were in vain. "Jason!" Leela screamed, pounding on the door. Inside, Jason felt the air grow colder. Shadows began to gather in the corners, taking on humanoid shapes. They advanced slowly, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. Finally, the door burst open, and Jason stumbled out, pale and trembling. "We have to leave," he gasped. "They don't want us here." The group fled, but the asylum wasn't ready to let them go. The corridors twisted and changed, leading them in circles. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by screams and maniacal laughter. In the main hallway, a figure appeared, a nurse, her face twisted in rage, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She raised a hand, and the walls began to shake. "Run!" Ethan shouted, dragging Maggie with him. Somehow, they found their way back to the side door and stumbled out into the night. The asylum loomed behind them, silent once more, as if mocking their fear. Breathless and shaken, the group piled into their car and sped away. When they reviewed their footage, they found more than they had bargained for. Shadowy figures moved in the background, and faint voices could be heard on the audio. But the most chilling discovery was a final frame that none of them remembered filming, a close-up of the nurse's face, her glowing eyes staring directly into the camera. The footage went viral, but the group never returned to Blackwood. Each of them suffered nightmares, and Jason, who had spent the most time in the isolation ward, claimed to hear whispers even in his waking hours. The asylum remained abandoned, its walls whispering the stories of those who dared to enter and those who never left.